I have come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass. And I'm all out of bubblegum.
I'm an old soul, got a funky sound. Gonna sing a song, turn the world around.
Hello everybody, Dr. Vasquez coming to you live in February of 2025, and today I'm going to review one of the worst and most unethical and unscientific articles ever published in my 33 years of looking at research. This is absolutely one of the worst articles I've ever seen. So I'm going to talk about it because it was exactly published 4 years ago in February of 2021. And I want to use this article as a conversation piece, obviously, to talk about how to look at research and how medical ethics and integrity has just gone out the window since the globalist COVID pandemic. And this is a really good example. So the fact that this article was published and continues to be published and available for free on the website of the Journal of the American Medical Association tells you a lot. It tells you that not only did they publish bullshit, but they're continuing to use the same bullshit to push this anti-nutrition propaganda for which they are obviously quite famous. So this doesn't need to be a long video, but I have been thinking about this particular article recently. I see that it was published exactly 4 years ago, and I'm going to show you why and how this article is so horrible and what the implication of that is. So, you know, a lot of people think, and a lot of doctors especially, a lot of doctors think, and therefore the same gets picked up by the general public and the mass media, a lot of doctors think that if something gets published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, that it has to be good, that it has to have been vetted, that it was peer-reviewed, that it was reviewed by the editors, that they have high standards, and all this, you know, bullshit. All of that's an excuse to not have to really do any thinking. So I'm going to show you through this example that, yes, indeed, the American Medical Association and its Journal of the American Medical Association, they publish absolute crap. And the solution to that is, number one, you can't trust these journals that everything they publish is going to be good. And number two, you just have to read the article yourself and decide if it's good or not, you know? So for example, like I obviously read a lot of research and that's my job and I love it. But, you know, I, as a reader and compiler of data, I have to read everything critically. You know, I can't just like download an article, sit down with a cup of, you know, lavender coffee and think it's going to turn out great. I have to read it critically, and that takes more effort. It's sometimes exhausting, sometimes it's frustrating, but, you know, the job of a reader, I guess the job of a reader is to be a critical reader. I mean, unless you're just reading for pleasure, you know, if you're reading Ayn Rand's Fountainhead or something like that, you don't have to be too critical. But if you're, you know, reading at a professional level for professional reasons, then you have to read critically. And, you know, JAMA could publish something good. I'm not saying that everything they publish is propaganda. They could publish something good, but I have to read it and determine if it's good. I can't just say, oh, it was published in JAMA and therefore it's great. Same thing with the Lancet. Sometimes they publish absolute crap that to this day frustrates me. I remember reading an article from the Lancet. This was right at the start of the pandemic. So this would have been 2020. We were living in Spain. I was sitting in the car. My wife was in the grocery store, and I was sitting in the car reading research. And I remember reading this article from the Lancet. Absolute crap. And, you know, many of you know that the Lancet used to be probably the best journal on the planet. And over the last, you know, many years, they've just become a propaganda piece for first the drug industry and then the globalists. So I'll talk about that particular article another time. It was also on vitamin D. And they started the article talking about the vitamin D content in beer. Who could give a big damn about that? But that was one of the tactics that these journals use, is they just make the topic appear so ridiculous that no one can take it seriously. So that's one strategy. This is another strategy, the article that was published in JAMA. So let's look at the page right now. So this is still present. They haven't retracted it. It's still available on the JAMA website. As I've said before, a lot of times when the big journals like New England Journal of Medicine and especially JAMA, when they publish something that's anti-nutrition and therefore pro-drug or pro-vaccine, when they publish something that's anti-nutrition, they usually make it available for free. So you can see this article is available for free. Ironically, they have an advertisement on their website on the same page from Oxford University Press. They're trying to sell something, it looks like a book, Principles of Scientific Writing and Biomedical Publication, a JAMA editor's guide for authors. Hard copy available now. Navigate the complex pathway from manuscript submission through to successful publication. Well, I mean, that's a big irony, right? Like I've said before, I've actually published one letter in the Journal of the American Medical Association. This was actually published back in 2004. And they had published actually another bullshit hit piece against vitamin D. And I critiqued it, and I submitted my letter, and they published it. But I remember very clearly, my letter had 3 paragraphs. Usually, obviously, and I mean, this is typical everywhere, but usually you have an introduction and then the body or the meat of the argument and then a conclusion. So as I recall, it was 3 paragraphs and they took out the middle paragraph. So all I got to do was introduce my argument and then, some little dinky comment at the end, but they took out the bulk of the argument. So the irony is, and they did publish it. This was, again, back at the end of 2004. But the irony is, here's, JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, on their website, next to one of the biggest bullshit articles ever published, they're talking about, how to successfully submit your article for publication. When they themselves, gutted my publication in their own journal. So anyway, let's move on. So, this was total garbage for at least 3 reasons. And I want to communicate clearly why this is bullshit for 3 very clear reasons. One is, the most important, is that they delayed treatment for about 11 days, up to 17 days, and I'll show you that in just a moment. They delayed treatment by more than 2 weeks in these patients with moderate to severe COVID, and then they concluded that the treatment didn't work. Well, nothing's going to work after a 2-week delay. So that's number one. Number two is they used bolus dose. You can see the title of the article. They used single high dose of vitamin D3. Let's see how much they used. I think it was either 100 or 200. Yeah, 200 international units. So they gave what's called a bolus dose, or a single large dose of vitamin D. And we have known for literally almost decades, if not many years, but I guess decades now that I think about it. We've known for decades that treatment doesn't work. So you can't give a massive yearly dose of vitamin D and expect it to work the same as the same amount divided over weekly or even daily doses. So daily dosing is physiologic. Bolus dosing, giving a huge dose all at once, is not physiologic, and it doesn't work, and I'll show you exactly why. So some of you know that back in 2004, so 21 years ago, I published a major review, and arguably one of the most important papers ever written on vitamin D, because it was the paradigm shift, So I wrote that in 2004. Now we're in 2025, so that makes it 21 years ago. Even then, we knew that bolus dosing didn't work. So, here we were almost 20 years later, 17 years later, and they used bolus dosing. So it's pure fraud. So the fraud of this article, again, I said it has 3 strikes against it very clearly. One is they delayed treatment for 2 weeks. Number 2, they use bolus dosing when we have known for decades that doesn't work. Literally decades we've known it doesn't work for at least 20 years. And the other aspect to this, so to retract an article, to have an article withdrawn or retracted, the article has to meet at least one of 4 criteria. One of those criteria is that if the publication itself was deemed unethical, then that is cause for withdrawal. So, for example, and the reason for that is obvious if you think about it. The reason for withdrawing unethical publications is because we don't want the research literature, as it's called, filled with articles that produce good results, maybe important results, but were done unethically, like the syphilis experiments that were done on African American men, or other studies that have used abandoned children or adults that have mental incapacity or something, so they couldn't have given informed consent, and then they had to undergo surgery or drug treatment or something like that. We don't want to promote or advocate unethical research, so if it does get published, it's a target for withdrawal. And this is another example. This article should have been withdrawn either because of bolus dosing or the fact that they delayed treatment for 2 weeks. And again, I'll show you that in just a moment. That by definition makes the treatment unethical. The intervention was unethical. And that becomes a third reason to withdraw the article. So again, for 3 reasons, this article should not have been published and it should have been withdrawn. The fact that it remains is clear evidence of absolute corruption from head to toe throughout the organization of the American Medical Association, throughout the organization of their journal, but also, for example, why hasn't another organization like the Endocrine Society or the American Board of Internal Medicine, why haven't some of those organizations stepped forward and said, look, you have to withdraw this. It's misleading, it's wrong, it's unethical. So again, the continued existence of this one publication tells you a lot about corruption in medicine. So again, they used bolus dosing, 200,000 units. We know that doesn't work. We've known for 20 years it doesn't work, and they did it anyway. But let's see if they state it here. Otherwise, I'll show it to you in just a moment on another. Yeah, so they don't mention it here. So I want to say one more thing before I move away from this page. And I'll try to keep this tangent as brief as possible. Again, you see that they're advertising their own publication on Principles of Scientific Writing. They're advertising that directly next to one of the worst and most unethical publications I've ever read in my 30-something years of looking at research. And I'll tell you what that represents. If you look at most articles, as I have looked at many of them, if you look at articles that are specific to how to think critically and how to analyze research, and on top of that, I also did a pre-doctoral research fellowship with the NIH when I was in my last year of medical school. And in that pre-doctoral research fellowship, sponsored by the NIH, we actually had courses on how to design research, because that was the purpose of the whole program, was designing research, but also how to critique research, etc. Because you have to look at research, obviously from both sides. How to do it right and what it looks like when it's done wrong. In the review articles, in the courses, in lectures on how to read research, they almost never talk about what I consider to be the most important factor, and that is you have to know what the hell you're talking about before you even read the article. And so the structure of the conventional analysis of research keeps people trapped away from actually ever seeing the fraud that's committed in the research. So if you look at most articles and most courses on how to analyze research, they talk about looking at methods and statistics and things like that, but they never talk about using common sense, and that's the downfall of this article. They never talk about actually just using common sense and reading the damn article and looking for, the obvious mistakes. They want to trap the person who's doing the analysis. They want to trap that person in focusing on cohorts and comparison groups and methods of statistical analysis. They want to keep you trapped in that because that's probably not where the error is. And so I'll show you. Arguably, so again, this article can be analyzed from two different perspectives. One is from perspective of expertise in vitamin D, at which point I would say, well, obviously this is going to fail because they use 2,000 international units bolus dosing. That has no possibility of working. So from an expert level, I can shoot this down quite easily. But let's assume, or let's say that a person's reading this article and they're not an expert in vitamin D. They're just a reader who knows how to read and think. They would still be able to completely deflate this article. So let's take a look at my highlighted version of this article from a couple of years ago. Here's my personal copy of the article, obviously with notes, and I'll put this on the website when I post the video. So again, conclusions and relevance. Among hospitalized patients with COVID-19, a single high dose of vitamin D, which had no chance in hell of it actually ever working, compared with placebo, did not significantly reduce hospital length of stay. Okay, so that's their conclusion. No surprise. Let's go down and look at the most obvious and gross mistakes. And here it is. So look at this article. This article is 8 pages long. And here, I don't even know if they mentioned it in the text. But here, right here, is the evidence that you need to know that this was total bullshit. Time from symptom onset to enrollment was more than 10 days. Now, just because the patients were enrolled in the study, that doesn't mean that they were actually treated. So we're at 10 plus days from symptom onset to enrollment. So the way that a viral infection works is a person, quote unquote, catches the virus, and then they have a few days where they're sick, but they don't know that they're sick. That's the asymptomatic period. And that's usually 3 to 4 days. So these patients were already sick for 4 days, let's say, and then they became symptomatic. So now we're at 14 days. We're already at 14 days before these patients are even enrolled in the study. Now we have to look at what's the difference between enrollment and treatment. That's something else I remember from looking at this. Let's see if I find it. I think the difference there was another 2 days. Right, so here we are. I think they mention it right here. Time from onset of symptoms to randomization was 10.3 days. But just because they were enrolled and listed in the study, that doesn't mean that they were treated on that day. Let's see if I find it really quickly. Otherwise, I'll let it go. But I think that at some point in this, I think they said that they delayed by another 2 days between enrollment and treatment. I may have to do an electronic search just to see if I can find it. So let me do a quick search. I'm gonna search for the word enrollment to see if that. Well, it says no results were found. That can't be right. Let me do a different type of search. Yeah. So again, I'm just looking for a quick detail here to see if they state time from hospital admission. So it's right here, actually. Time from symptom onset to enrollment. Time from hospital admission to enrollment. So it was another day, but that's not exactly what I'm looking for. So I'll just go with, I'll keep it at 10 days for my criticism. If I don't find it really quickly here. Yeah. So anyway, they were enrolled, but that's not the same thing as starting treatment. They would have, and maybe they didn't specify it, but what they should have specified is they were enrolled on day 0 and they were treated on day 2 or something like that. That would be a way to describe this accurately. And maybe they did or didn't, but I don't see it right now. But anyway, we know that these patients were sick for at least 2 weeks before they even entered the study. 2 weeks. So then they were given a bolus dose of vitamin D. Well, the question then becomes, how long does that bolus dose take to be effective? So when they give a bolus dose, as they did here, when they give a bolus dose of vitamin D3, that's not the active form of the vitamin. The active form of vitamin D3 is what? For all the doctors out there, what is the active form? Most of you are going to get this wrong. What's the active form of vitamin D3? The biologically most important form of vitamin D3 is actually 25-hydroxy vitamin D, because that's responsible for 80% of the activity at the vitamin D receptor. It's not 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D3. So again, in order to really critique and analyze this article, you would have to know, the reader would have to know, what is the time delay between giving a bolus dose of vitamin D3, how long does it take for that to get converted into 25-hydroxy vitamin D3? Because that represents 80% of the activity at the vitamin D receptor. It's not 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D3. It's 25-hydroxy vitamin D3. So what is the time delay between administering a bolus? This is a trick question. No one's going to get this right unless you've read my other articles and looked at the data. What's the time delay? This is a trick question. What's the time delay between giving a bolus dose of vitamin D and effective vitamin D status, let's say? The answer is it never happens. And I'm going to show you one of my previous slide presentations really quickly. So we're going to transition from this article to one of my slide presentations right now. All right, so this is a slide presentation that I did a couple of years ago. So we'll just go through. First, I wanted to show you where vitamin D works in its antiviral mechanisms, and it works everywhere. You can see my other videos for this. This goes back to 2005. This is an article I published in the British Medical Journal. Oh, let's see. So remember I said that in 2004 I published the vitamin D paradigm shift. In 2005, I, along with John Cannell, we excerpted a few important points from that bigger article, and we published it in the British Medical Journal. So one of those major points was that bolus dosing cannot be cannot be used. And so we talk about physiologic dosing. That means daily or weekly dosing. It cannot be bolus dosing. So again, we published this in 2004 and then again in 2005. Yeah, so look at point number 8 here. Pharmacologic competence. No bolus dosing of D3. Dosing must be daily or weekly physiologic dosing. So then, in around 2020 or 2021, I wrote this article, Vitamin D Pharmacology Infographic, and I'm going to show you some of the infographics here. So, let's go back and look at that one. This is what normal physiologic dosing of vitamin D looks like. Daily dosing, maybe weekly dosing, but you get a slow rise in vitamin 25 hydroxyvitamin D3. You get a slow rise, and that's what you want, and that's what you would expect, because the conversion of vitamin D3 to 25 hydroxyvitamin D3 takes a little bit of time. It doesn't just happen because you take a pill. Yeah, so this was done in 2021. So physiologic dosing follows a physiologic curve. Now, on the next slide, I'm going to show you what bolus dosing looks like. So put this image in your mind, the one that you're looking at right now. It's a slow curve, depending on your dose, whether you're at 5,000 or 10,000 international units, but it's a very physiologic, normal-looking curve. Now I'm going to show you what the curve looks like with bolus dosing, and this is why most people get the answer wrong when I ask them how long does it take for bolus dosing to have a clinical benefit. So this is what happens. Look at the slide. Look at the yellow mountain, so to speak, or the yellow peak. That's what happens when people receive a bolus dose of vitamin D3. They get a super high non-physiologic peak. I mean, this would never happen in nature. And then that vitamin D3 it spikes in the blood, and then it gets distributed to the tissues. So you basically end up saturating the tissues with a weak agonist, which then functions as a weak antagonist at the vitamin D3 receptor. But you can't see it. After a couple of days, you get the peak in vitamin D3 in the blood, and then it goes into the tissues, and then you can't see it in the blood anymore. But it's in the tissues for weeks or months, antagonizing the vitamin D3 receptor. So here, my second lighter yellow color is exactly what I just said. Tissue or adipose D3 antagonizing the vitamin D3 receptor. And this goes on, looks like here, tissue levels of vitamin D3 can remain elevated for up to 3 months, antagonizing the vitamin D3 receptor. And then later you get some 25 hydroxyvitamin D. But it's antagonized 25 hydroxyvitamin D. So remember, they already delayed treatment by 2 weeks. Then they gave a bolus dose, which requires at least 1 more week to peak the vitamin D levels with 25 hydroxyvitamin D. So now you've delayed treatment for 3 weeks. Listen to what I just said. They effectively delayed treatment for 3 weeks because they waited for 2 weeks, and then they gave a treatment that needed another week to function. So that's 3 weeks. But when you get the peak here of 25 hydroxyvitamin D3, it's being antagonized in the blood and in the tissues by the weak agonist, which functions as an antagonist against the vitamin D3 receptor. And you can see the citations, etc., on this page. The other thing is, when people are exposed to a supraphysiologic dose of vitamin D3, the body then transcribes the so-called detoxification enzymes for vitamin D3 to prevent toxicity, right? So the body senses this huge peak in vitamin D3, which could potentially be risky, And so the body has a way of getting rid of excess vitamin D3, and that is to push it into the 24-hydroxylation pathway. So remember, the active form is the 25-hydroxylated form. But if too much vitamin D is given at one time, then the body converts that into an inactive form, which is the 24-hydroxylated form. So not only do you have an overdose of a weak agonist that functions as an antagonist, not only do you have a full delay of at least 1 week, if not 2 weeks. So remember, now we're at we were a 2-week delay followed by another 1 week delay up to 2 weeks more. So we're somewhere between 3 to 4 weeks of delayed treatment here. That's completely unethical. But on top of that, they've induced the 24-hydroxylation detoxification pathway, which is going to get rid of the vitamin D and antagonize it while it's there. So I think that makes very clear the fact that this is just total garbage. Total garbage. And yet here we are. Let me see if we have anything else to look at. Here we are, a full 4 years later, and the glorious American Medical Association has not retracted this article. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about research fraud, anti-nutrition fraud, forcing people into the only treatments that are so-called approved, like molnupiravir, which is totally worthless. And also, I did a comparison of molnupiravir against vitamin D, and molnupiravir costs, I believe it was $700 per dose, compared to vitamin D at about $7 per dose. And molnupiravir is a pharmacologic and clinical disaster, whereas the research on vitamin D, which I reviewed back in 2021, was spectacular when it was dosed and administered appropriately. So let's look at this article, the PDF, since I have it up, and then I'll close out this video. I just want to see if I made any other comments. I did make one other comment on the same page. The vitamin D group was more sick than was the placebo group. They had more hypertension, they had more diabetes. Yeah, significantly more of both. They had 9% more, no, is that right? Yeah, 9%. They had 9% more. No, I'm sorry, I was looking at numbers versus percentage. They had 17%, no, that's right, 7, not 17. They had 7% more hypertension, and then what? 12% more diabetes? I mean, those are significant differences. So the people who were randomized into the vitamin D group, they were metabolically sicker than the placebo group. So that's an important difference. So again, onset of symptoms, which means 3 or 4 days, to randomization was another 10 days. So you're at 2 weeks before they even start treatment, and then they implemented a treatment that needs another 1 or 2 weeks. So you're at 4 weeks before the treatment can even work. I mean, it's just completely absurd. It's completely absurd that this was published, that it remains published, and that none of the bigger organizations, American Board of Family Medicine, American Board of Internal Medicine, the entire Endocrine Society, which has 16,000 members. You know, again, this is beyond JAMA. This is the American Medical Association and then JAMA. But then it shows you that this whole facade of medical integrity just doesn't exist. Yeah, so look at what they say here. A single oral dose of 200,000 international units of vitamin D can rapidly increase 25-hydroxyvitamin D levels. It's not rapid. It takes at least a week to 2 weeks. So the present null findings cannot be attributed to the failure of increasing. That's total bullshit. That's total bullshit. So, oh yeah, so here's the other comment that I like to make on this study. You would never see a study, for example, in patients who have epilepsy or post-traumatic seizures. You would never see a study get published where they delay treatment for 2 weeks or 4 weeks or 3 weeks. That would be completely unethical. You can't just let those patients, sit there and have seizures and do nothing for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks and then conclude that the treatment didn't work. That would be totally absurd. But that's precisely what they did here, right? If this had been an antibiotic study and they delayed treatment for 2 weeks, for 3 weeks, for 4 weeks, that would be considered absurd. It would never get published. And if it were published, it would get withdrawn, right? So look at the difference in the scientific standards or the lack of scientific standards when they want to try to make nutrition look ineffective or even dangerous. They publish the absolute lowest level of garbage that they could possibly imagine, and that's what you're looking at right now. Patients were, and they even admit it toward the end here, patients were given a dose of vitamin D3 after a relatively long time from symptom onset to randomization. Yeah, 10 days for a treatment that needs another week to work, right? So, again, this is just absolutely criminal. It's criminal that it was published. It's criminal that it remains published. And it's further criminal that all of these, medical certifying boards, like family medicine, internal medicine, endocrinology, they never did anything to stop this garbage. So by implication, it kind of incriminates, the whole medical machine, not just one publication with one article from one organization. So that's what I wanted to say about this. I did write, and I published this on Academia. Let's see, sorry. This is it right here. I did publish this call for retraction, and I published it more than once, but on February 20th. Oh, that's pretty good. So I published this on February 20th of 2021 in response to that article that was published on the 17th. So the other article was published 3 days prior, and then I published this on Academia, and then I made a few updates. But, even back then, I called it out. And then here are the criteria that I used. Oh, these are the official criteria. So within medical publications, as you can see here that I cited, guidelines for the retraction withdrawal of published research, published by the Committee on Publication Ethics. And you can see the criteria here. Number 1, findings are unreliable as a result of major error. So that applies. And number 6, unethically conducted research. You can't delay treatment for 2 to 4 weeks and then conclude that the treatment doesn't work. That's just total garbage. So, yeah, so like I said, I published this on Academia. A lot of researchers look at Academia, of course. That's why I put it there. And I'll put this on the website as well. So this gives you a really detailed analysis of that garbage article that I just looked at. So anyway, a lot of us, and including me, but a lot of doctors and researchers and scholars and professors, a lot of us were censored, for the first couple of years of the pandemic. We were censored because the United States government, for a couple of different reasons, but the most organized reason was that the United States government forced, social media platforms to censor and delete anybody who said anything against the globalist narrative, which was, this is a deadly disease that's highly contagious and the only solution is vaccines and then a few other orphan drugs that were totally worthless. So for any of us who called that out and said this is just stupid, we got censored. Like, I had my books deleted from Amazon. Back in 2014, I published a small book, not that small, but I published a book called Antiviral Nutrition. I published that book in 2014. It wasn't the greatest book, but it certainly covered the topic. And it was on Amazon, published by Amazon for 6 years. And like I said, it wasn't perfect, but it still had, 5-star ratings. So apparently it was, worthwhile to the general public who was reading it. And in March of 2020, at the start of the pandemic, Amazon censored my book. They deleted it from their listings. So again, a lot of us were censored for speaking the truth about nutrition and immunonutrition and how to support immune defenses against viral infections. Again, I've been working on that for 25 years. I published it in 2014. It was on Amazon.com for 6 years with a 5-star rating. And then it got deleted because no one could talk about nutrition anymore. But look at the absolute garbage that is allowed to be published and which is allowed to remain on the internet. It's total fraud, but that's allowed to remain published. Whereas, talking about nutrition, I get censored all the time if I intentionally or accidentally say something and put a video on YouTube that talks about nutrition. I still get censored. It still happens in real time, even though supposedly, especially now that Trump is president, especially they're supposed to stop doing the censorship. But that censorship, the algorithms and the internal workings of these social media platforms is still censoring stuff left and right. But they'll censor the truth, but they allow, again, complete garbage to remain published and available for free on a website that gets, millions of visitors every month, which is the American Medical Association. So anyway, I'll wrap this up. That's what I wanted to say. This is just huge fraud. Implicating the fraud and corruption of JAMA, its parent organization, the American Medical Association, and also all these other groups, family medicine, internal medicine, endocrine society in particular, and other organizations involved with so-called endocrinology and metabolism. So again, the other thing that I said is you cannot trust these organizations to publish good data because they publish garbage. It doesn't mean that everything is garbage, so you have to read it critically. And, every article from any journal requires critical thinking, not just reading it and repeating back what they say. You have to look at it critically because in one line of the article, just like we saw with the JAMA article, in one line of the article, that may be sufficient to reveal the fraud of the article. And like I showed you, they wrote it twice. Once in the table, and most doctors aren't going to really analyze the table. And then they said it toward the end when they were doing kind of a self-critique. They said, yeah, we delayed treatment by 2 weeks. So, but they weren't intelligent enough to know that not only they delayed administration of the treatment for 2 weeks, but the treatment itself needed another week or two to become active. Assuming that it was ever going to become active when you've basically flooded the blood and then the tissues with the D3, which is the inactive form, a weak agonist functioning as an antagonist. So this had no chance in hell of working, and yet it remains as evidence that nutrition doesn't work against COVID, which is completely false. So again, hopefully most of you know, I did a huge review of this topic back in 2021 when we didn't have that much research, but we still had enough. And the research was overwhelmingly conclusive that properly administered vitamin D was supremely highly effective against COVID. So I invite you to take a look at that video. It's on my website. So at one point, I compiled all those videos that I did on vitamin D. I compiled all of them to a single page, and I called that the Vitamin D Gold Mine. So if you go to my websites, either healthythinking.substack.com or inflammationmastery.substack.com, if you look for Gold Mine on those pages, just do a search function. If you search for Gold Mine, you'll find the vitamin D articles. Sorry, vitamin D articles and videos. I also posted my published articles with the videos. So I hope you're all doing well. I'm going to say this one more time. Here's the summary of today's video. JAMA publishes garbage. American Medical Association has no integrity, otherwise they would have pulled this. Other organizations within medicine could have called for a retraction of that article. They didn't do it. That tells you a lot. The other thing is, just because it gets published in a big journal doesn't mean it's good. The other thing is, just because it gets published by the American Medical Association doesn't mean it's bad either. You actually have to read the article and decide for yourself. Maybe the article has some good stuff that you can take away, and then it has other bad stuff that you have to leave behind. You know, so an article can be horrible, and it can still provide useful information. So, for example, going back to the article that was published in JAMA that I'm talking about, was it horrible? Was it corrupt? Should it be withdrawn? Yes, all of that. It's horrible. But what can you get from that article that's still good? Well, they documented the safety of high-dose vitamin D. So, you know, I could look at that article and say, yeah, it's totally horrible and unethical and worthless. And it still has some useful data because they gave these patients 200,000 units and none of them got toxic. So, yeah, that still supports the safety of vitamin D. But it was done within a context of absolute corruption and incompetence. So that's all I'm going to say about this. Hope you're doing well. Take care. And I'll get this on the website as soon as I can. Thank you much. Bye.
I'm an old soul, got a funky sound. Gonna sing a song, turn the world around. I whoop that ass, you know I got the moves. Spank that ass, I'm gonna make you move. I ain't no player, I'm just here to shake. Hump that ass, no time for heartbreak. I'm the one who brings the rhythm to the night. I keep you